Never have I ever had a keyboard that I hated this much out of the gate, but that eventually won me over before it threw me back into a spiral of regret. Not by its own accord though. The Naya Create is another Kickstarter tale of promises of a fully split, tentable, wireless, slightly column staggered keyboard. But if that goal wasn't already challenging enough, it additionally adds modularity through a series of interchangeable attachments to the mix, to expand, modify, and customize additional input methods. It is that which likely sets it apart from every other competition out there and desperately made me want to use it. That or the desire to make it work after having spent over $800 on it. Did it succeed? I actually don't really know. Let's begin as per usual with an overview over the hardware and its proposed features, which there are many of. Like the mentioned modules, which I'll talk about in the next chapter, in an attempt to make this video a bit more digestible. But like that big breakfast I ordered last Saturday, just because it's served on tiny plates doesn't make it any less food. So strap in as we dive deep into the makings of this arguably beautiful board, which, like an elegant creature from the depth of the sea, reveals itself from its slumbering case. Which, I must admit, is quite convenient. It's not as small as I'd hoped for though, on the account that portability was a key point for me. The Naya Create itself is impressively compact though, but more so thin than wide and tall. Fully spread out, it's bigger than I expected. But that's also because the center contains one of Naya's biggest selling points, a place for the magnetically attachable modules. With it being this slim, one might wonder how normal switches even fit in here. The answer is, well, they don't. Not even regular low-profile ones do. Instead, we're dealing with mini chocks, an even tinier version of regular chocks, which I didn't even know existed, but my excitement for a newfound way to push down plastic was short-lived as I quickly learned that I might not be the only one that doesn't know that these exist. Because there doesn't seem to be anyone who makes custom variants, nor even sells the stock ones, anywhere. Now, I might have just not looked hard enough, but I fear that unless you buy additional ones together with the Naya during your initial purchase, you'll have a hard time changing this down the road, and changing it, you might want to. I certainly did. This comes down to personal preferences, but to me the linear reds I picked were simply too hard to press down. If you're wondering why I didn't just pick another option when I ordered the Naya, well, the website's description of these is pretty limited and I have the suspicion that the tactile and clicky variants are just the same. Luckily there is a remedy, a time-consuming and annoying remedy, but at least there is one. I took the spring from a lighter regular chock switch, the Sunsets, which have a 40 gram actuation force, and put that into the very same housing and closed it again. The result? Even though the spring is made for a much longer traveling distance, it's a resounding success. A lighter typing experience for my weak little hands. However, the new spring was still a little too hard for my liking and I didn't want to strip the rest of my Sunsets for parts, so I instead ordered the lightest chock switches I could find, kale blue ones, with an actuation force of just 25 grams. I suspect that due to the smaller housing, the spring is pre-compressed, resulting in more than just 25 grams in order to push it down. Regardless of what the real number is though, I had ended up with the lighter typing experience I had hoped for. I was very much relieved as it felt like going from having the big breakfast to the diet option the Sunday after. Both my digestive system and the bathroom staff at the local diner rejoiced. But typing still felt a bit awkward. There is always an initial learning curve, but I think the Naya is taking the crown when it comes to how steep that curve is, even though it has a pretty common size of around 60%, which is, if you ask me, one of the most convenient ones. If you're unfamiliar with this terminology, 60% usually means that the board has around 60 keys, with the functions row and numbers pad as well as the arrows missing, relying on layers instead. However, I'd say the Naya Create is more like a 70 or 74% keyboard, with the additional 14% stemming from the extra keys such as the thumb clusters or the function rows on both ends. Like these two ear-shaped keys at the inner on either side, which at first I found quite troublesome, as the elongated shape frequently caused accidental hits whenever I tried to go for a T or Y. When you do eventually want to use them on purpose though, you have to hit them dead center, because otherwise the key sometimes doesn't fully depress. Now I know that these might sound like two contradicting statements, but I ran into this a lot during the first week of using the Create. There is a custom designed stabilizer beneath it, but it wasn't enough to keep the cap level to prevent it from jamming the switch on the way down. The thumb cluster also suffers from this, not as bad though, and probably also because of how I have my Create tented up, which I'll get to in a second. Here too, because of how the keycap is designed, it ironically invites you to push it in from the side, which causes unnecessary friction on the way down, making typing feel like having speed bumps on a highway. However, if you fully tent the Create, the motion to activate these keys changes, and the wraparound design of the keycaps start to make much more sense, as they are not here for you to push in, but rather for your thumb to be more comfortable. But I have my Naya Create tented only about 1/3 in, which results in the issues I mentioned. I might be the only one dumb enough to misinterpret the intention here though. The rest of the keycaps fared much better, and coming from my custom 3D printed lames on my Unicorn, I immediately felt right at home. There are a lot of funny looking shapes present here. Sometimes I wondered whether this was really functional in origin or entirely cosmetic though. What I can confirm, however, is that this too adds to the learning curve of the Naya. On the plus side, for all the RGB lovers out there, each cap has shine-through lettering, which shows off the very nicely leveled characters. If you want even more lights, attached to the edge on either side, we also have some strips, which I always adore. That makes for quite the show. However, I'd argue that this isn't its most visually striking feature. That entirely belongs to the tenting ability. If you're unfamiliar with this term, it refers to the angling of each half to create a more natural typing position for your wrists. Unlike the real-world activity of the same name, I really love having the board tented, for comfort and for looks. In theory, you can set any angle you like, however, it's likely that you will end up using either the highest or the lowest. Apart from the thumb cluster issue, which again might be on me, it's simply easy to go all in or leave it entirely flat, as anything in between introduces fiddling, as there are no stops on the smooth hinges. That being said, I did end up on the 1/3 I mentioned before, even though it took a few tries to get there every time I propped it up. Apart from the fiddling, that's not the only issue you might encounter though. The distance between the regular keys and the last 2 rows on either side have varying distances depending on the tenting angle, which made for some stretchy movement, especially when laid entirely flat. Luckily, almost all of these issues started to disappear over time, or with my modification, which turned the Naya from pain to pleasure. I generally started to like it. There's something that made me want to come back to it time and time again, preferring it over my other boards, until I had to charge it. That's because the 2 USB-C ports, one on each side of the board, are pointing inwards, making for an awkward looking piece when plugged in, especially with the supplied cable, which is arguably the ugliest one I have ever seen. Which just begs the question, why? Why indeed? If the Naya Create wasn't interesting enough by itself, there are an additional 4 modules to expand its functionality. First is the Touch, which is, as the name suggests, a touchpad, a multi-touchpad that is, which even though it has a comparatively small surface, I found easier than expected to navigate my operating system with. However, there's a noticeable delay and a lack of accuracy, which threw me off at the beginning and that I hope the team behind the Naya can iron out with a software update. There are also a number of multi-touch gestures it ships with. 2 fingers will do what you expect, like scrolling, where I found the touch to sometimes miss my input entirely. 3 fingers will act as your middle mouse click, as well as switch between desktops and launching mission control on macOS. Lastly, 4 finger swipes are reserved for media controls, which I very much welcome. However, here too, and in general, with all multi-touch gestures, the failure rate is quite high, or was quite high for me. Then there's the track, which I found the most responsive and fun to use out of all of the modules. My last video was about trackballs actually, among other input devices and how they can potentially improve your productivity, so if you're still hungry after this one, go give that one a watch too. Spoiler warning though, the trackball didn't win, but attached to a keyboard like this I did find it quite convenient, especially with the scroll mechanism, which can be activated by twisting the ball. It might even be a good companion for the Touch, having different types of pointer control at your disposal. There are 4 additional buttons which can be customized and reassigned to your standard mousing keys or anything else you'd like. Then we have the Tune, which I was interested in the most, especially for video editing. Unfortunately, mine stopped working. I don't actually know why, but I have the suspicion it has something to do with a reported issue that affects earlier versions, whereas they can discharge past the point of rechargeability. This is a big bummer as I never got around to using it for a video project, so I can't actually report on whether it would have been any good at it. There's also a touchpad on top, which is pretty neat. This unfortunately also doesn't work anymore on my unit though. The fourth and final module, which I didn't order and only recently has started production, hence the lack of presence in this video, is the Float, a device designed to navigate three-dimensional spaces, also known as a space mouse, a term which I learned about 15 minutes ago. This isn't a new invention though, space mice have existed for a while, and if the comments on my previous video are any indication, might be something I want to check out in the future. Anyway, all of the modules also have one thing in common, they all feel very good. There's a nice level of refinement present here, which makes handling and also docking feel fantastic. Every module can also go on either side, so you can mix and match them as well as add these later on. However, there might be a reason why you would want to get at least two from the get-go. Wireless. Yeah, that's a big minus point if you ask me, but the Naya doesn't work wirelessly without at least two modules. Not because there are some hidden antennas in here, but rather a battery or batteries. The Naya does turn on without them, but you'd be lucky to type out a full sentence before it dies or loses connection. So for those out there that just wanted a keyboard, you'll be either tethered forever or you'll have to pay the price. Which is a lot since the Naya itself is already quite expensive at $499.99. Add to that at least $79.99 for the cheapest module, the Touch, and you'll be spending at least $659.97 to get a fully wireless keyboard. But I'd say at least in its current state, the Naya's wireless functionality was so bad that I resorted to having it plugged in all the time. Anyway, charging them is also a bit of an adventure. Yes, you can use the ugly Y cable, but you can also use wireless charging, which worked well, but I never actually did use it as I had it plugged in most of the time as mentioned. I would have preferred to use a USB-C port to be honest, even if I was forced to using that ugly Y cable, which still haunts me like the leftovers of my big breakfast. This is going to be a shorter and more cautionary chapter, not due to a lack of interest though, but rather my inability to fully uncover the secrets of the Naya Create. Inspecting it, I once again have to comment on the impressive slimness of it. From the get-go I was curious how they jammed everything in here. The only visible screws from the outside that seemed accessible were the 13 Phillips heads around the black plastic ring on the underside of the module dock, which were quickly removed. But the ring wouldn't budge and seemed to be tightly attached to the frame. I tried to pry it open but gave up after a while due to a fear of breaking it. I happen to have broken quite a few boards over the years for these videos, or damaged them in some way or form, and I was hellbent on avoiding it here. However, even with the limited visibility, we can still see some interesting bits, like the magnets which are lined up around the ring along with the back of the switches, once again showing off just how slim this board is. Discouraged but not stopped, I shifted my attention to the rest of the board, which as mentioned doesn't have any visible screws to unlock other than these immovable hex screws on the back, leading me to the source, the topside screws that are hidden underneath the keycaps. A total of 16, with 12 of them using the hex butts we just saw, while 4 are actually secured into the frame of the board itself. With all of them gone, an audible aha moment escaped my breakfast feeding hole. Let me elaborate. Usually a keyboard is made out of what I'd like to call a sandwich, consisting of plates, foams, PCBs and other elements which combine to make one juicy typing snack. The Naya Create is not a sandwich. The Naya Create is a burrito, because instead of jamming things on top of each other, they are slid into the wrapped aluminum casing. What an impressive feat, I thought. Just look at the end piece here, which for its delicacy and lightness feels almost surreal to hold. I was excited to dig deeper from here, but unfortunately that's about as far as I got because I could not, for the sake of all big breakfast lovers out there, figure out how to disconnect the ribbon cables that seem to tie everything down. I do believe that there's some way to disconnect them, but not without ripping something off like the 3M sticky tape that seems to be attached to the connectors. The same goes for the other side, which is attached in a similar way, albeit the hinge not separated but integrated into the magnetic ring piece of the keyboard. A final attempt was made to see whether the rubber feet might hold the answer of unlocking, but that too was stopped by the sticky part ripping, which resulted in me waving the white flag once again. As mentioned, I have destroyed more than one electronic in the past by not being careful enough, so I did what I didn't do last Saturday and decided I had enough. From what I could see though, I'd say the Naya is the most miniature board I've ever handled. But that comes at a price. The repairability of this thing isn't going to be fun, if possible at all. Replacing either of the built-in batteries on their eventual demise is going to be a challenge. Another question I had was whether or not the hinges can be adjusted or retightened, which doesn't seem to be the case either. The only benefit a disassembly like this will have is the ability to clean them, which you might want to do every now and then, as in my short time already, grease stains have surfaced after repeated hinge action. This excursion might have ended with a bit of a letdown, but I still got to see some parts, like the power toggle, which I didn't even notice had these color markings on it. A nice little detail. During my reassembly, I encountered another challenge related to the switches. I'm not sure if this is common with mini chocks or if this is caused by the frame of the board, but putting some of these back required quite a bit of force. Some got stuck halfway down and needed to be reinserted. A different socket helping every now and then, but not always. In the end, one particular area simply caused every switch to get stuck. After a while, I figured out that the pressure on the switch was simply too strong, resulting in the friction causing the switch to get stuck. I don't know if this is caused by me modifying the switches or if it was like this from the start. I blame my tampering. The remedy here feels a bit unsanctioned, but pushing down the frame in the area relieved said pressure and the switches started to behave like they should again. Once again, the Naya paints a split picture. There is a magnificent design present here, details and machining that is impressive to say the least, a construction method unique to it and one that I applaud for its successful execution, albeit with some problems. On the other hand though, none of this is exactly user-friendly. Granted, what I am doing nobody is supposed to, it clearly wasn't designed to be taken apart or to be customized, which luckily the software is. Normally this would be a straightforward chapter, but unfortunately there have been two incidents as to why it won't. First, I broke it. Yeah, during the last chapter, even as I tried my absolute best, I somehow damaged it to the point where it won't connect nor work properly anymore. For example, only two of the RGB lights on the left still light up, while an entire row on the right kicked the bucket. However, the biggest source of regret is caused by it no longer being recognized by the software itself, making any configuration changes and firmware updates an impossibility. Normally that wouldn't stop me, after all I used it for a while and have made many configuration changes along the way, so I could just report on my past experiences. However, Naya has since released a major update. With it, a lot of the promised features became reality. This is the second reason as to why I won't be talking much about it, as it changed the Create so drastically that my experience isn't representative anymore. Yet, I still want to highlight a few things as I think they're quite significant. In particular what you can do with the Tune module. When it was still working, it would have no friction while it was powered off, only adding the little notches once it was connected to the main unit. If this electrically charged feature wasn't fascinating enough on its own, it is now user configurable, and if it works as advertised, is an amazing feature that lets you set up your scrolling experience to your heart's content. Other modules gained the ability to be configured as well, which I wasn't able to do either, meaning you can now reassign buttons and other functions. There's also a slew of other improvements regarding the update and pairing process. Here too, I cannot report on how much better it has become, but I hope it did. Still missing is the automatic profile switching, depending on the active application. If that eventually makes it into Naya Flow, which is how the software is called by the way, the Create will reach a level of customization that I think makes this a dangerous contender for the be-all, end-all solution, if only there weren't the hardware issues. The Naya Create is a fascinating object of desire. Among boards in my possession, it is a rare occurrence. Never was I initially more disappointed by what I received, and never did it turn around halfway through into a big cheek-to-cheek smile. That doesn't mean it's all good. If you watched this video until now, first of all, thank you, but you will also have heard plenty of my frustrations. Yet there's something that repeatedly drew me back in, because in the end it was a lot of fun and would still be. When it did work, it gave me an extraordinary experience no other board ever did, and likely will do for some time. Some of the hardware shortcomings are pretty serious, yes, but my biggest gripe was and still is the stock switches. They are just terrible. I know this is a very personal opinion, but couple that with the lack of any third-party options makes this just such a frustrating choice. But acoustically the board has bigger issues than the switches. With the tune module attached and the board plugged in, there's a noticeable buzzing sound. I tried my best to capture it, but it's very hard to hear. All of this is probably making the Naya Create sound way worse than it actually is. That's why I do want to emphasize that overall, I actually like it, which is why it pains me so much that it already sunsetted for me. But I hope I get to try it again, maybe not this version, but an eventual second iteration, with all of the shortcomings resolved. Kickstarter projects always carry certain risks, and here too it proved to be true, but I already know that I want a Create version 2.0. Just as much as I want to order that big breakfast again.
Daddy, want the big breakfast?
Hey, thank you so much for watching. I hope after having digested this entire video, you don't feel like having had a big breakfast. Terrible food jokes aside, the next video will be back to some PC building, but a different kind, so stay tuned if you're interested in that. Anyway, thank you so much for watching and see you again in the next one. Bye!